What decks remain in Wilds of Eldraine's final chapter? The field narrows as we anticipate the set coming after.
It only matters if it ladders. Comment below as we navigate through Week 8's metagame shifts. Now let's untap. Alrighty. In Tier 1 world, we see Dimir Fae drop off a cliff, but the main four are still here claiming trophies and pushing the rest of the meta out.
In Tier 2, Golgari Aggro and Esper Control retain their status for another week, but no newcomers have joined.
And last but not least, in the Brewers Corner, we take a look at Selesnya Aggro and Mono Black Control. First though, let's get to our Tier 1s, starting with Soldiers. While many may disagree, I'm going to go ahead and call it right now. Azorius Soldiers is the best deck in the Wilds of Eldraine standard meta. This weekend, it took 9 out of 16 slots across the two MTGO top 8s. I repeat, more than 50% of all MTGO top 8 slots went to Azorius Soldiers, including both trophies. Featured here is Victor Carvalho's list, which took down the infamous Jabberwocky in the finals of Saturday's MTGO Challenge. Now, what I love about this list is that Victor eschewed the Yodian Soldiers and the Regal Bunnicorns, opting instead for that 5th counterspell main we see in the form of Protect the Negotiators, and a full playset of Werefox Bodyguards. This shift optimizes your card selection and power against Esper Midrange, which we saw getting pushed out, and Domain, where sometimes you just need that pesky Archangel out of the way so you can crack through for the final points. Regardless, Soldiers is king this week, and I will be surprised if it isn't at the top at the end of rotation. Prepare your sideboards accordingly, folks.
So, I have to ask, quick question, although it may not really be that quick. Look, we're in the final week, so I have to ask, how can anyone really prepare against this deck? It has so many great threats with Flash, tempo strategies. They're trying to push out Domain and Golgari, which are two of the 3 most popular decks right now. So which way do you go when you're facing Azorius Soldiers? Do you go the way of, extra board wipes, hand hate, or oops, big threats?
So there isn't an easy way through this deck, and I think that was the point in the design, right? You get to this stage in the meta where you start a metagame and you're like, okay, what's the most powerful thing we can be doing? What are the best engines? What are the most powerful cards individually? What are the best synergies? And you look at all 3 of those variables and you say, how do we build a deck? And usually it starts with what's the best engine? What has the biggest endgame? And you see that with Domain. Then the question becomes, how do you undercut Domain, right? And this is where Azorius Soldiers has really fallen in. The problem that a lot of these builds have had is that they weren't optimized. And I think as we get towards the end of the meta, you start to see more optimal lists that take those minor flex slots and really start to position correctly. So there isn't a simple answer, because what you have here is a diversification of threats that make it incredibly difficult to deal with. Are you going to play against the hand that goes Recruitment Officer into Resolute, into Harbin, and then game? Or are you going to play against the hand that goes Recruitment Officer, couple counter spells, Wedding Announcement, Knight Errant, here we go on value? There's so many routes you can go, and that's why I think this deck is immensely popular, because it is unpredictable and difficult to deal with. It has different game plans, it adjusts, it's flexible. You want to beat it, you almost have to slant your deck so heavily to deal with it in the main that you're going to lose points against the other decks, and that's why you see this pattern where you have Domain, Esper Midrange, and Soldiers at the top, because anybody else that tries to push through can't get points against the others, because they have to slant so hard to beat 1, they lose against 2 and 3. And that's why you're seeing this domination at the top, in my opinion.
That does make a lot of sense. One of the I always called this throughout these past state of the metas a non-traditional aggro list. I kept saying that. I think this pretty much sums up why. Right? You can't just slot in the stuff that you slot in against something like, say, mono red or other aggro lists. So it makes it very difficult to kind of sideboard against. But thank you for your extensive answer. I think this is definitely one deck that a lot of people aim to beat. But talk to us about another list that everyone wants to beat right now, the Gatekeeper of Standard, Domain.
So what you see here with Domain is, again, an optimized end list, okay? Jabberwocky made the finals of Saturday's MTGO Challenge with this remix to Domain, pushing 4 up the beanstalk into the main and 5 early pieces of removal for the meta, along with a startling 3, I repeat, 3 knockout blows on the sideboard, and a couple of Jace the Perfected Minds, right? So let's break it down. The early removal here is an answer to the uptick from Soldiers, Esper Mid, and Mono Red, but also pays dividends against Golgari aggro. So long as we don't see proper control in numbers, I would expect to see those 2 go for the throats and 3 Virtue of Persistence. 4 up the Beanstalk, on the other hand, is a hedge against the mirror and control, as well as simple sideboarding slots to come out against aggro. Because you know if you're playing Mono Red, the first thing you're going to do is side in 3 knockout blow and an Obstinate Bailoff for 4 up the Beanstalk. You don't need the card draw, you just need the life gain, right? Last but not least, the 2 copies of Jace is a mirror breaker bet. For those who haven't played much of the Domain mirrors, many times it will come down to one player getting decked due to the minimum of 8 Sunfalls between the 2 players, which prevents card advantage from translating into board advantage. So Jace is extremely potent here, giving you a win con that your opponents have few means to stop. I love the positioning here. Congrats to Jabberwocky. Hell of a finish.
Yeah, we've seen quite a few variations over the last few weeks of this deck. It's often been called a gatekeeper. I just called it the gatekeeper of Standard. Where do you see this deck positioned when we look forward to some of the archetypes that are coming down the pipes in Ixalan?
Dominantly. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm already brewing up Dino lists. I'm already brewing up all sorts of lists with Ixalan, but Cavern of Souls is coming, and it will let you cast Atraxa and Archangel through Soldiers counterspells. Like Azorius Soldiers, for all that it's amazing right now, if Cavern of Souls gets printed, which it will, and Atraxa doesn't get banned, and it probably won't, we are going to see this dynamic time and time again where the best thing to do in Standard is still just ramp up to Atraxa and counter it, or cast it uncounterably, I should say. So yeah, it's the gatekeeper, and I think it's going to be.
Yeah, I think a Wubberga deck right now is a gatekeeper. I never would have thought that, but that's how it is right now. Now talk to us about a deck that tries to get underneath Mono Red Aggro.
Absolutely. So Lenny took 3rd place in Saturday's MTGO Challenge, and another copy snuck into the top 8 of Sunday's Challenge as well, keeping Mono Red in Tier 1 land for another week. This list featured the 2 Nahiri Warcraft and 4 Witchstalker Frenzy numbers, slanting heavily for Witchstalker Frenzy this week. So we see an uptick in Play with Fire as well, cutting all those Monstrous Rages and the Phoenix Chicks in favor of some more early interaction. This tells me that we're hedging for Soldiers and Esper Midrange pretty hard in the main board and relying on raw velocity to push through Domain. So, I mean, I wish Furnace Punisher reliably triggered against Domain, because then we'd have ourselves a full-on Wrecking Ball in the sideboard. But if you look at the sideboard, do you really see any particular card that screams, I'm going to wreck Domain players? Because I don't. I like, you're going to side out the Witchstalker Frenzies for some Jayas, maybe? Maybe. But you might just want them for velocity to get the Topiary Stompers and the Archangels out of the way. And perhaps that's where Lithomantic comes into play. Regardless, I'm not seeing a comprehensive sideboard for Domain here, but I'm definitely seeing one for Azorius Soldiers.
All right, so you talked to us about which red that you prefer to see right now. I did see another list when we were looking at the data, Red Machine and Nothing But Land best of 3. It was a small 12-player event, but that edition used 4 Monstrous Rage, 3 Urabas Forge, and it got 1st place. Why would you prefer this build that we just showcased over that one, considering the meta right now?
If I don't expect to see Esper Mid or really any deck with Shieldred, I think it's a great place to be where you push into Monstrous Rage. I still disagree with Urbrask's Forge fundamentally at this point, because as much as I love it, it starts at a 1/1 for 3 mana, which in a red deck is not where I want to be. And even though you're going to have quote-unquote inevitability, not really. A lot of people are running enchantment and an artifact hate right now, and they should be, because those are getting played off the sideboard in Soldiers and the main board in Domain. You're going to see enchantments in every deck in this format, basically. So I would expect to have people find answers to Urbrask's Forge. The Monstrous Rage, I actually really like that. If we're not worried about Soldiers, that's where I shift those Play with Fires over to Monstrous Rage and say, okay, let's go ham on Domain, and let's see if we can just get there with Monstrous Rage just pushing that tempo. Because remember, every Monstrous Rage is kind of like a Bolt Plus if they don't have the removal for it.
Oh yeah, I guess that makes sense. Talk to us about Esper Midrange. What's going on with this deck?
While suspiciously absent from the MTGO challenges, and I mean it didn't top 8 a single one, Esper Midrange did take down a trophy and another top 8 slot in Rap Solo's 51-player community tournament. So the list we're showing is about as traditional as expected, with 0 Fairy Masterminds or Urtai hedges and minimal counters for domain. The sideboard also falls within about the usual parameters, so congrats to J Stack for their victory in the tourney, proving that Esper Midrange continues to deserve Tier 1 recognition as we near the end of Wilds of Eldraine Standard.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I've been running it personally, and oh my gosh, this deck just continues to do what it needs to do against the other lists. Now let me go ahead and ask you a question. I've personally been toying with 4 Virtues of Loyalty in the main board to some success, focusing on that card. Is it really time to turn the power of that card on fully? And what would we give up to do this if that's a good game plan?
So I think the question with Virtue of Loyalty is how many copies how many copies can you play before it gets very redundant, and what you're giving up is usually Fairy Mastermind or additional counters / removal, because it's kind of your 2-drop slot that also lets you check up to the 5-drop slot later in the game if you get there and want it. But I think the main giveaway here is Fairy Mastermind, which it's your check against Up the Beanstalk. You know what I mean? Like, it keeps you in for card advantage against them, which I like. But at the same time, Virtue of Loyalty does a great job of just getting out and saying, we are the aggro. We will take over these games. We do have inevitability. And so it's kind of hard to argue with that raw power as well.
That does make a lot of sense. Now, let's go ahead and jump into a very shortened Tier 2 meta list. Let's start off with Esper Control. All right, I'm kicking it off. Esper Control. We are mainly looking at a deck that knows what it needs to do, right? Calmarin piloted their build into the top 4 of Rapsoda's tournament, proving that Staff of Completion and Ashiok actually do go hand in hand. Do we finally have a Super Friends deck worth discussing, y'all? We've got Wandering Emperor, Teferi, and Ashiok making up the 3 robust planeswalkers that produce tokens, and those tokens can gummy up the board after a while. Vraska rounds them out and supplements all of them really well with proliferate ability built in. Now, this deck, I have to note, has the full playset of Goat Throats, Make Disappears, a Farewell, and 3D Populates. And then the sideboard is composed of Lockdowns, Cut Downs, and an Anoint with Affliction. These round out the preventative plays possible with this deck, indicating the strength of soldiers, the strength of mono red, to try and get underneath your typical control list. Now, Planeswalkers have been a force to be reckoned with in the past, particularly with control lists. This one's no different, though it may be one of the last we're getting since Planeswalkers have been announced to be 1 per set, right?
Yeah, that's going to be one hell of a shift, I'll put it that way. So looking at this list, do we need all 3 Staff of Completion? And do you have any concerns for getting decked by having out these Staff of Completions with Ashiok?
I hadn't thought about that. I guess you have to, right? Because Jace is starting to come back into play in some of these lists. And that's one card that immediately comes to mind that I worry about with that. But no, as far as 3 Staff of Completions, I think 2 is appropriate. I don't want to rely too much on that combo with Ashiok. And like you just said, Jace is in existence. If we do see more Jace, and then there's the card Breach the Multiverse as well, which can really mill you. And sometimes you see those in domain lists. Sometimes you see those in Orzhov control lists. So yeah, just be mindful of the meta and make sure that that mill isn't an alternate win con in the opponent's deck.
Fair. Well, let's move over. Let's talk about Golgari Aggro. It's still around.
It sure is, and it's still kicking. We did get a single top 8 at Rap Solo's 51-man tourney by Miss Byrne. Kept this archetype in Tier 2 for us for another week, but really, will it last? Let's begin by discussing a card that has made its return to this list in the past few weeks, Graveyard Trespasser. There was a question for some time regarding whether to include this or not over something like Frillback, which, if you're being real, is a 4-drop, right? Now, it's great for the anti-artifact, anti-enchantment. It's great for the graveyard hate, as I pointed out recently in our Discord. But it is a 4-slot card at minimum to be effective in those ways. Now, because graveyard usage has been modestly and moderately in play Throughout Wilds of Eldraine, we've seen Light Reanimator, we've seen Light Graveyard Effects, Light Recursion. We're seeing this shift back to Graveyard Trespasser. I mean, not only does it help get rid of cards in the graveyard specifically, but it's also a great 2-for-1. Only requires 3 mana to start working for you in this way. Another card I want to note is the Iron Crag, often an underutilized piece of ramp that allows you to play some of your bigger plays in the deck 1 turn sooner, such as Shelly or Archfiend.
So, speaking of Archfiend, we've seen a build like this before, but is Archfiend just the better version of this deck, considering Domain has a bigger endgame and Turtle can be stymied on the board by the presence of basically every other creature in Standard right now?
Oh my gosh, you raised a really good point. And I just want to raise, in addition to that, one other huge point. Y'all be wary of that Glissa versus Archfiend. There's still a lot of Golgari aggro. Golgari loves 3 copies of Glissa, so the mirror, be careful. You're going to run into that, and that can be an insta-kill if you don't play through that sequence correctly. Other than more damage, I do want to say, though, that Archfiend, to kind of play devil's advocate, Archfiend is really good against aggro, and specifically when you pair it with Golgari's known ability to go for that 1-for-1 removal pattern. So paired with removal, Archfiend also has the ability to drain your opponent. So keep that in mind. If you're facing a lot of aggro, it might be a good card to slot in.
Fair. And that brings us to our next segment, one I always love, the Brewer's Corner. Let's get things cracking with a little Selesnya aggro. Alrighty, so credit to Anthony the Maniac for submitting this morning. Thank you. Appreciate that. Was very curious what you had in mind when you were talking about this in the comment section. And for those who are wondering, yes, we do read the comment section and reply religiously. So what we have here is a deck that's kind of half aggro, half tokens, with the ability to go fetch some of the pieces it wants with Huntsman Redemption, and then just rebuy through Sarah Paragon. So I love this little combo we have where we can go Teachings of the Corinne into Huntsman into Paragon. Like, we're going to get to Paragon, and it's going to happen quickly. And when some of these things, such as Teachings of the Corinne, go to the graveyard, we're just going to recast them. So it's kind of interesting. I've never seen Huntsman and Paragon in the same deck, but I love that those two are paired together for the simple reason that you just keep recasting, keep going, keep grinding out that advantage, but you're doing it on the lower end of the curve, and you're threatening a lot of damage really quickly. The big note I have for this is that Restless Prairie from the new Ixalan set is going to be a great manland with this Blossoming Tortoise scenario.
Yeah, absolutely it will. I forgot to mention that we were talking about Golgari aggro, but Blossoming Tortoise, my goodness, it's gonna have a lot of fun in this upcoming set with how many manlands are going to be playable right now.
Right. Well, let's get over and talk about Mono Black Control. Max, take it away.
All right, so this deck, I can't believe it got a result, didn't it? It top 8'd, and that's wild because I've been asking for a long time. Y'all have been noticing week after week about Mono Black aggro and whether it was going to come back and in what form. And we see here it's hand hate friendly, y'all. And then also I want to point out the synergy with Nightmare and Candy Grapple. It makes Candy Grapple a decent piece of removal. And then not only do you have, of course, the obvious 4 Shellys, which are just a must-have, but Rankle's Prank works really well with this as well. If in the early game you're causing them to discard quite a few cards, Rankle's Prank coming in the mid-game, late game, just adds to the stress you're putting on your opponent. And then Braids, of course, we can sacrifice the Nightmare to that. Spellspawn Coven is another card that I haven't really been playing, but takes advantage on the flip side of being a really high impact 2/3 flyer that also makes your opponent discard a card in the late game, and that's very valuable. And then Big Shelly. If you look at Big Shelly's condition, I think Hand Hate is where it's at for making Big Shelly flip.
Yeah, if you're looking for a deck that looks at Domain and says, okay, we can't counter it, but we absolutely can make sure you have nothing and you have to top deck to get to us, and maybe that's going to be the path. Once we get to Ixalan, once Cavern of Souls is in the format, maybe the path is just, let's strip your hand and force you to like hit the right lands into the right spells on sequence off the top. That might be where we have to go.
It really might. I know I've done it to Domain many times with Dimir Midrange. Just the Hand Hate package helps a ton. So hopefully it gets more robust in this upcoming set.
Well, the problem is that these domain lists are still running Obstinate Bailoff, and as we saw from Jabberwocky's list earlier, it's running 2 in the sideboard. And if this starts to take off, and all of a sudden we see mono black with hand hate everywhere, I guarantee you the domain players are going to get salty and play 4. Like it's only a matter of time.
Yeah, we're already seeing it. We're already seeing it with more people playing Lily again. So yeah, you're right.
Yeah. And that brings us over to our final segment, predictions for the upcoming week. Now, Max, we've looked at 8 archetypes tonight. What are your predictions going into week 9 of Wild Standard?
Week 9, we made it, y'all. Wow, we're finally here at the end of this cycle, pretty much, with Wilds. I just have to say how proud I am to sit at the proverbial mountaintop after the end of a long journey with you, Darth, and look upon what's been wrought. We've tracked over 20 different decks over the course of this set, analyzed the gallery of different archetypes week in, week out. Now, what I've learned is that in designing these sets, Wizards has opted for more being better, more available archetypes, more colors involved in each one, more creature types than your typical typals that, I would have played when I was a younger player, that we're used to seeing set to set. Fairies came and went, soldiers surged, humans did pretty much what they always do, which is just kind of exist, rise to prominence, and then fall to mediocrity. How would they outdo themselves, Wizards that is, in this next set? Stick around, because the Rebellion already has developed some lean, mean decks for you to try out in your week 1 adventures into Caverns of Ixalan. This set isn't over, however. We still have one more week of analysis to go. So please let us know what you saw, what you plan to play in these final weeks of Wilds down in the comments. And while you're down there leaving us a comment, go ahead and like and subscribe. But also consider joining the Rebellion for as little as $1. Me and Darth and the team behind the curtain work very hard to bring you our analysis and keep up to date with this data week in and week out. And we'll continue to do so, we promise, through Lost Caverns of Ixalan. Now, Darth, let the folks at home know what to expect from us in the coming weeks as we prepare for a brand new set and thus a brand new standard.
Well, first, I'm just going to say that there's this moment where you said typical typal, and I just thought, let's say that 5 times fast and see what happens. Like, what a tongue twister typical typal is. However, next week will mark our final state of the meta for Wilds of Eldraine Standard before Ixalan drops, and I think it's important to note that our 2 most prolific finishers in this metagame were both originally masterminded by reigning player of the year, Simon Nielsen. So, hats off to you, bud. You earned that title in every way possible. My prediction for this following week is kind of sadly more of the same. We haven't seen a deck break through the miasma that is Soldier's Domain, Esper Mid, and Mono Red for more than a week here and there. And while I truly hope to see some mad scientist at work breaking this meta, once we get to the final few weeks, the Brewers tend to move on to the new set, which, if you looked at the spoilers for Ixalan, can you really blame them? Regardless, tune in next week as we wrap up Wilds of Eldraine Standard with some spicy sneak peeks at Ixalan brews, as long as they're on Moxfield, God willing. And also, early access will be happening on Twitch, where you can catch myself and the rest of the Rebellion on November 9th. I know we're going to have Griffin Rider rocking. I know Max will be rocking. I think we get Dabo in this time, so he should be rocking. It's going to be a great time. We're going to have teammates just trying out deck lists. We're sitting in the Discord brewing up a storm right now. On a final note, please consider joining our membership tiers to support this type of content. If you'd like exclusive content, we have the Coffee and Grinders category now for $2.99 a month, and joining it will give you access to my personal sideboarding guides and notes. So for all of you out there wishing we put more sideboard guides out, there is an option that will give you weekly, if not daily, updates as I test out Tier 1 archetypes and take notes. Thank you for being part of this community and giving back, and until next time, untap, upkeep, resist.
Resist.